Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for joining this talk, which is very timely on the German election and the possible outcomes. We have here our president, Jörg Wuttke, who will be leading the discussion and really good expert panel discussion. So without further ado, Jörg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Esther, and it's really a wonderful panel of old friends, I must say, and I'm very glad we do this after the elections. We were toying with the idea of doing this before the elections, but then we would have ended up in speculative territory, and I think it's just better to do it post-mortem. Of course, for many of you, Germany is very familiar. Many of you might be Germans, but we do it in English, particularly for the European community. And a lot of Chinese members are interested on what it does to the Europe-China relationship or Germany-China relationship. You will come across a lot of colors. That will be something that is very important. The blacks stand for conservative, the reds stand for the left party, the pink ones stand for the SPD, which is the socialist. Then we have the Green Party, obviously in green, and then the Liberals, which, by the way, full disclosure, is my own party, is in yellow. And then, of course, the AfD, but I guess they will not pop up. They are in blue. And then we have so in a way, we have all kinds of things. You have to get familiar with a couple of words. One of them is the traffic light that indicates a joint venture, I was nearly saying, a coalition of the Reds, meaning the socialists with the liberals and the Greens. And then there's Jamaica. Jamaica, this is a very good sounding name for a very boring topic, meaning a coalition out of the blacks, the conservatives, the Greens, and the yellows, the liberals. So as you can see already now, the Green Party has this finger in every pie. Before I start this also, let me say there's very funny title story in the German daily, the Tageszeitung, which actually showed a blue jumper on page number 1. And it says, it's a boy. That just shows it that after 16 years of leadership by, as we call her, Mutti, now we have an unknown entity. We don't know which boy it is, but there is going to be a boy, and as the new chancellor, whenever it is. So I welcome Reinhard Bütikofer, who is a former head of the Green Party in the German parliament, as well as the European Parliament. In the European Parliament, he's in the China delegation group, but also first and foremost, he's an intimate insider in coalition talks. He was very hands-on engaged in 2017, 2018, the famous 170 days of coalition talks. So it's not just China that invented the long march, also Germans can do it. So Reinhard, what is your take? Congratulations to the result, by the way. To win 5.8% is just magnificent. And so what's your take on the whole thing, and where are we going?
Well, good morning from Berlin. Thanks for having me, Jörg. And this is a very timely event you're organizing. I think we're entering a new era in German domestic politics. Because after 16 years of leadership by Chancellor Merkel, this will certainly mark a new departure, but also, and that was expressed most clearly by the leader of the Liberal Party, FDP, Mr. Lindner, in one of the TV discussions on election day. This election has transformed the German political party system. We don't have big parties anymore. We have now just a number of medium-sized parties. The most successful party ran up 25.7% of the vote, and the Liberals, the fourth among the four leading parties, have more than 11. So the distance between those defining forces is not as big as it used to be. And to give you another number, there is only one single deputy to the German parliament that was elected with more than 50% of the vote in his own precinct. So basically the division between four players, the conservatives, the socialists, the liberals, and the Greens, is opening a new game. And I think it's also going to be a new era because the status quo oriented, predominantly status quo oriented policies that have shaped Germany successfully for so many years are being questioned more than ever before, and particularly by the liberals and by the Greens. And I would argue that of the four pillars of German foreign policy that have been unquestioned for so long, all of the four pillars are somewhat sort of under siege today. The multilateral system is not as it used to be. The transatlantic relations encounter new surprises almost by the month. The European Union orientation has to be newly discovered, and the reliance on trade as the major dimension of German foreign policy may also be questioned somewhat. And increasingly people say, well, maybe there's also some geopolitics to be looked at from Berlin. So I think, number one, there's a new era. Number two, I expect that there will be a traffic light coalition, a coalition led by Olaf Scholz, who led his party to a remarkable victory, and joined then by the Greens and the Liberals. This is not a foregone conclusion, but this seems to me the most probable outcome. The other alternative would be a coalition also including the Liberals and the Greens, but under a conservative leadership. Today I even question whether the Conservatives are really united to want that. I'm sure their leader wants it to save his own skin, but I'm not sure his party is prepared to go there. So what would that new coalition be bringing to the table? What new kinds of focuses would it pursue that might be relevant on foreign policy? I would say first and foremost, Greens and Liberals are the parties of the younger generation. Look at the distribution of votes in this election, and you will find that among people up to the age of 30, Greens and Liberals dominate, whereas the Conservatives and the Socialists, the two traditional parties, fall behind quite substantially. The Liberals and the Greens are also parties that want to innovate, that want to change. They're not always seeing it from the same angle, but that is an attitude, a sentiment that is shared more between the two parties than with any of the others. And the third angle is that both parties have developed a very strong relationship with the business community. That used to be the traditional privilege of the Liberals, to be most closely affiliated with the business community. But over the last couple of years, Greens have caught up there and now also have a strong voice there. That's something that will be relevant because Greens plus Liberals will hold more mandates in the new coalition than the Socialist Party that will certainly take the Chancellor's office. So there is a relevancy for that angle. And it's also interesting to note that the Liberals and the Greens will be the first two parties to talk to each other before they even start negotiating with traditionally major parties. The second change that I expect would be that there will be a much more proactive European policy. So expect Germany under a new government to get engaged more deeply and more proactively with common European efforts, including on economic issues. The conservatives have always been reluctant to, for instance, to accept something like Eurobonds. That may not be all that foreign to a new government. And thirdly, I would say there is going to be a major focus on climate policy and also the international dimension of climate policy, and the European Green Deal that the European Commission President von der Leyen has put on the agenda will find strong support from the new coalition. What will that mean for the role of Germany? I would say it will be more proactively European, going it alone not all that often. I'm not sure it will just be a resuscitation of the traditional Franco-German axis. I don't believe that the Franco-German axis alone can lead the EU. So I would expect maybe that there will be efforts to include countries like Italy or Poland through the Weimar Triangle mechanism. There certainly will be a louder German voice in the discussion around so-called strategic autonomy, which has been treated like an awkward topic, mostly around Berlin, strongly pushed by the French, strongly hated by NATO, and the Germans have been equivocating to some degree. I would expect that this will change. So what does it mean for China policy? That's my final point, Jörg. I think when you go by the triad definition of EU-China relations that Commission published in March 2019, with China being a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival, I think you should expect that the China policy of the new coalition will focus more on the competition, in particular in economic issues. It will still seek cooperation with particular focus on climate, but it will not be willing to sacrifice standing up to issues that play a major role in the systemic rivalry just in order to pursue cooperation. So the systemic rivalry aspect will grow in relevancy. And this is not just because the Free Democrats and the Greens are the most China-critical parties in the German party political system, but also because these are developments that have strong backing in society and even in the business community. Thank you.
Now, before we ask Professor Fong to give us the view from Beijing, you were there early 2018 when you were trying to have a Jamaica coalition, and then Lindner unplugged last moment. We ended up with red and black. That is to be discounted as a possibility?
Well, you can never say never in politics, but I would strongly discount it still. Lindner, the leader of the Free Democratic Party, cannot run from the negotiating table a second time. We have argued throughout the campaign that it is necessary to getting into government in order to save Germany's climate policy and to push for climate and digital innovation. So how could we then say, well, we wanted to be in government, but not that much. And for the socialists, it's only the fourth time that they ended up with the largest number of seats in all of Germany's history since the Second World War. Why would they squander such an opportunity?
Right, right. Well, Professor Fong, China, I've been here for a while and I have witnessed China's reaction towards changes in government in Germany, in particular 98. Beijing was extremely worried about losing Kohl, 16 years in office, to this unknown entity, Schröder. And then the same happened when Schröder was stepping down in 2005 and this East German lady came on board. Merkel, she's going to be a reliable partner. And now after 16 years and Merkel having such a good relation with the Chinese top leadership, how is the anxiety level in Beijing right now?
Thank you so much for asking me to join this very important discussion. I want to say hello to people I know, Janke and others, which we may not say, but I saw these 74 people online. Thank you for joining this discussion. Janke, well, I think we expected the result of the election. Yeah, we made predictions well. It goes like what we thought, what we predicted a couple of weeks ago, at least a couple of days ago. Number one, we predicted the election, the new government will be dominated by one of the two big parties. So you say maybe it's SPD or the black. So this is the one thing we think we made a right prediction. Second, we think the small parties are critical in the law process. You mentioned the march, maybe not that long march, but last time was 6 months. How many months will I expect this time? People told me probably the New Year Eve speech will still made by Chancellor Merkel. So Greece liberals will be very important element in establishing this new government. As far as Chinese policy is concerned, Chinese-European, Germany relations is concerned, I think probably in the era of transitional, traditional period, we expect some difficult situation. I don't know because we really don't know what the new parties when they set in office, their views. We know the SPDs, we know the Merkel's parties, but we don't know what about the Greece liberals, their views. So transitional period probably is something which we are not able to, we feel uncertainties. Let me put it in this way. As far as China is concerned, I think China will continually take this line. Whoever in the office in Berlin's in the coalition government, what size or what kind of new government will look like? Germany is still the number one in Europe, many ways. So Germany will continue to be important allies, the partner, as far as China's European policy is concerned. That is one thing. Secondly, I think, although people are talking about the European power structure following the election, I agree with our former previous speaker mentioned either Paris or Italy or Poland, but there must be Germany there. So so Germany will continue to be a very important power in European politics, which means maybe when the Europeans make the decisions, they don't have a figure like Merkel, such a long established, influential, long experienced figure. But Germany's voice will continue to be important long. That is something which we think. Finally, strategic autonomy. I think this term is not just about China EU. It's also about China United States. China about China EU, US, EU, Russia. I think I got the feeling Europeans, correct me if I'm wrong, are thinking their relations, their own rules on the world stage, more and more, not just in the trade angles. In other words, Europeans was satisfied with playing a superpower, super trade power, if you like, because you have a single market. Europeans are proud to play a normative power, but a lot of people forget, this kind of normative power was in the framework of NATO, in the framework of allies with the United States. Only superpower. So, and now, as far as the Europeans are thinking about their relations with the United States, so they started to think about their own new position, new rules. This will actually will have some certain impact on the Europeans' relations with other big powers. York, maybe I stop here.
Dongping, I before I ask Joachim to come online, the former new chancellors always had a mishap or problematic appearance when it comes to China. I mean, Schröder was caught up in this Belgrade bombing of the Chinese embassy, and then Merkel met the Dalai Lama, but it always was basically overcome and then basically brought into a very smooth cooperation. How willing is China, given all these wolf warrior noises that we hear, is in order to be equally forthcoming and embracing of a new German government?
You wouldn't believe, Jonker. A lot of people think Germans are not typical Europeans, or at least definitely not the typical Westerns. We think Germans look things in a big picture. Mm. Policies are more or less balanced, and this impression was actually enhanced by Chancellor Merkel. Never make emotional speeches, never say extremely things, maybe behind the doors. So this image is so strong, and it's so strong that people think expect her predecessor, her successors will continue to think in this way, which means pragmatical approach, continuation will continue to be the Germans' approach as far as China policy is concerned.
Yes. Well, Scholz was running as Merkel 2.0, so maybe there's nothing to worry about. Joachim, all yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Full disclosure from my end, as you started the same way, Jörg. I'm a member of the Conservative, of the CDU. I was in the Konrad Adenauer House for more than 12 years. But if I sum it up, what happened on Sunday, I'm with Reinhard. We can expect and should expect traffic light coalition. Actually saying that I do understand that non-Germans are a bit puzzled looking at Germany. The election took place on Sunday, and we still are asking ourselves how the next coalition will look like. So this is a little bit special, as you said in your opening remark, Jörg. I do believe Chancellor Merkel will not give the New Year speech next time, but Chancellor Scholz will do. Looking at the next government, of course, I mean, a change in command will lead to a change in strategy and tonality, no question about it. But nevertheless, I do not expect a dramatic change. Why? Because one of the current parties of the current German government, the SPD, will lead the next government. Yeah. So, and of course, they have to say, but the world wasn't flat under the era of Merkel, and the world isn't flat looking ahead, and everything seems to be in the air for sure. And if you look, I mean, China, they came up with their dual circulation strategy already some years ago. The US is working on their strategy. And EU, as Reinhard mentioned, is working on the strategic autonomy framework, and I do see some common ground here because all of these three superpowers, they want to increase their independence. So looking at the EU first, I believe the EU will emancipate itself from China as well as from the US, taking the strategic autonomy framework into consideration and the whole global geopolitical environment. I believe the main drivers from the member state levels will be for the time being Germany and France. Germany will take over the G7 presidency by January, while France will take over the EU presidency. France is we're going to see grand elections in France coming up in May. So I do believe we're going to see a lot of action out of Germany and Paris whenever we have a new government in Germany in place. But what is really, I think, a massive change. So I personally consider the EU Commission and the EP, they really made it to increase their power. They are really now a powerhouse. And von der Leyen and the Commission, they started first conditioning the access to the so-called recovery fund to the member states. They need to be compliant with fundamental EU rights. That was for me a very first step, and now there will be a second step, and there is the so-called supply chain law in the pipe, and the supply chain law will condition market access to Europe to let's say fundamental rights, definitely to ethical rights, talking about labor rights, maybe even on environmental issues, and certainly on economics. And I consider this will be a game changer, independently what will happen from the what will happen in Germany, what will happen in France. This is already in the pipe, and this will change the partnership, not only with China, but definitely with China. I think it will create some headaches for the corporates doing cross-border business. I hope, and maybe I'm romantic here, that China that China can consider, under the umbrella of common prosperity, to have a big chance right in front of them. By recognizing all remaining ILO regulations, by kicking off needed reforms under the umbrella of common prosperity, to meet the compliance, to be more a partner than a rival. But as I said, that might be a bit romantic, and we're going to see what happens.
All right, thank you very much. Janka, what's your take on the election result? What does it mean to the EU-China relationship?
Thank you, Jörg, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's always a great pleasure. So I have 3 preliminary takeaways and then a little bit of explanation to that. First, I agree with Huang Zhongping. Germans are so predictable that even the polls were right, which is something that we haven't seen in any of the Western elections in the past, which I think is a good thing, and it says something about the Germans as well. The second preliminary takeaway, German politics is interesting again. That's also a good thing because it hasn't been super interesting in the past few years. And we have had this kind of melatonin state in which Germany was more asleep than it was awake. It was more reactive than actually shaping. And that leads me to my third preliminary takeaway, which is change is about to come, but it's going to be change with German characteristics. So I think that's important to understand because I do think we're at a very, very crucial moment here, but don't expect a major revolution that is going to take over everything and throw over everything overboard tomorrow. But don't underestimate the potential for change. And I would like to kind of argue a little bit why I think things are changing. So particularly with regard to the relationship with China, the topic is now front and center in all of the conversations that are taking place. And that's not just because it's China policy, but because we have a lot of what I would call because of China policy, because of China's changing role in the world, because of how it relates to Europe, because of how it relates to the United States. The strategic environment for Europe and for Germany is changing so massively that it is no longer a foreign policy issue. It is a kind of across the board government challenge, a societal challenge, and an economic challenge. The mood has become incredibly gloomy all across Europe. This doesn't stop at Germany's borders. And I think Reinhard has pointed that out as well in the beginning, that things are changing in the German public as well, in the business community. And it's kind of like the German government and the chancellery has been holding back some of the change that is happening. And I do think that that will no longer be the case. The other element to this is Germans want the status quo. But that doesn't necessarily translate into status quo politics. And I think that's an important distinction that people tend to forget. We really like the way the country is right now. We like it prosperous, we like it safe, we like it being a leader in Europe, we like it multilateral. If we want all that to stay the same, the only option towards that is relatively radical change of policy. And I do think that that's something that gets mixed up is, do you want status quo or status quo politics? And I think that the Liberals and the Greens have made an interesting campaign around this, saying, we don't want to change the entire country. That's not the point. We want for everything to stay the same, but therefore we have to change the entire country. We have to change how it does business. And that's, I think this is something that everyone needs to, who's watching Germany and is watching the German government evolving, needs to keep in mind. The other element of this is that there is a huge pent up desire for change also within the ministries. And I would say we've seen in the Trump administration what this can mean. In the Trump administration, the moves on China policy were so extreme because in many of the ministries, including USTR, there was a lot of desire for changing the tone, doing things. And so when that lid was off, when the government gave this kind of tone and then changed the line, then it marched relatively quickly on these issues. And I do see some of these tendencies in the German ministries as well. There is this desire for, hang on, this is not going the way it's supposed to be going. This is not working for us. And so that can have an acceleration effect. And that one I would also not underestimate. I think there is in terms of kind of the relationship with Europe and other partners, I would fully agree with Reinhard that the next government would, by necessity, have to define its approach a lot more European, understanding what shaping power Europe can have with an active Germany, but it will also redefine its entire relationships with other partners, so the transatlantic dimension, but also the Indo-Pacific dimension. There's huge potential in that. I think also Professor Fung has underlined the fact that Europe's power is punching still below its weight in terms of what role it could play in the world. And the question is whether a more active and proactive German government could free up that space. That remains to be seen. I think that we, and then to kind of finish up with that, the main topics that we're seeing at the moment at the EU level are also have translated into the German election. So the green transformation and the digital transformation, that's the success of the Green Party, that's the success of the Liberal Party that you see right there. It's kind of the two pillars that are key for the future of where Europe is supposed to march. And at any instance, they will run into China. That is like the China question will always be an issue here. And I expect frictions. I expect a tougher stance that could, in the end, lead to more realistic and better relations, more sober, and maybe more on kind of on an equal footing. So it's not necessarily always a bad thing, but I think we will see a massive recalibration, particularly emanating from Germany. But that's my prediction. So with this, I would probably hand it over to Noah.
Janka, the smaller countries, when I'm talking to the ambassadors in Beijing, they're sometimes very unhappy about the fact that there is the German-French show. I mean, the whole concept of 17+1 was built on the fact that, you know, these 17 or 16 countries never got really on the limelight. Again, recently there was this discussion, Macron and Merkel together with the president. So how much is the new chancellor, or how much is the new government willing to actually show more solidarity and cooperation with the smaller member states, in particular when it comes to China?
I think that's a big question that is on the table at the moment. I do think that the Franco-German axis alone, as Reinhard has said, is not going to cut it on these questions. It's Rome that you need to have on board, it's Warsaw that you need to have on board, but it's also the Nordic countries that you definitely need on board. You need the Dutch, you need a really, really broad coalition of countries where this really matters. So this will be the task for the new government. I see a bit of a problem here on Olaf Scholz, who was very focused on the Franco-German axis. It was an interesting remark when in one of the debates that was taking place between the candidates, they were asked where their first journey would go. And Laschet's answer was he doesn't know yet, which was probably not the smartest answer to give. And Scholz's answer was Paris, which is the traditionally right answer. This is what a German chancellor has to say. And Annalena Baerbock kind of revolutionary said Brussels. And there is some truth to that. And there is something in it that people should think about, and what that would mean, and what that would kind of mean for what kind of German commitment to the EU that would mean. So I think this will be an interesting issue between the parties in hammering out the coalition, how strong the focus on the kind of Brussels and integrating everyone will be, and how strong the Franco-German tandem will be. We all agree, I think, in Europe that the Franco-German tandem is very important for the future of the EU. But I think it is about kind of the emphasis, and also the fact that Macron will be in a very difficult phase over the next few months, and that has to be taken into account as well.
So it's interesting to see that Annalena wants to visit Reinhard first and foremost before he goes to France. Noah, what is your take on this, in particular also when you weave in the US story, the US view on this one?
Well, thanks, Jörg. Thanks for inviting me, and good to see so many friends. I realize that I am the token American here, so it's up to me to give a little bit of the U.S. perspective. But I have to say, Jörg, it has not gone unnoticed that it's, at least on this webinar, it's America last. But I'm going to forgive you for that. I think the key point to make here is that people in the Biden administration want a German government and a European Union that they can engage with on the big geopolitical, big geoeconomic issues. And that of course includes China. And I think the main concern coming out of this election will be that it's going to take months until a coalition is in place. That's not just a US concern, by the way. I think in Paris, there are the same concerns. I'm sure Emmanuel Macron remembers 4 years ago how long it took for the German government to come together, and how long it took for Merkel to respond to his ideas on reforming Europe. So I think lengthy coalition talks are one concern. I think if Armin Laschet ends up dropping out, we could see this in the next few days, and that would sort of accelerate things and alleviate some of those concerns. But I think Joachim mentioned we also have a French election in April. So we are really looking at a period of about half a year when Europe's two biggest countries are going to be very, very inward looking, if we're honest about it. I think second point, what happens when new governments in Berlin and Paris are up and running? Janka talked about this a little bit. will there be a consensus between Germany and France on how to move forward on China policy? After this Australian submarine deal, the dust hasn't fully settled on this. One could question whether there isn't maybe a bigger divide between France and Germany. And will Germany and France be able to establish a semblance of consensus on China policy within the EU? I do think there's a better chance of that happening. A few of the other speakers have mentioned this. With a change of government in Berlin, all the mainstream parties in Germany are advocating a more European approach. I think the criticism of Merkel has been that there was always an element of Germany first in how she approached China. And I think a new government always opens the door to some sort of change. I would agree with Janka. I mean, if you look at public opinion, if you look at the mood in the Bundestag, at least the outgoing Bundestag, if you look at the Jörg, your recent report, the report from the European Chamber, the message coming out of the BDI, it's saying there needs to be some degree of change. And we're not talking about embracing a sort of confrontational Trump era policies towards China. I get a little frustrated when I hear Olaf Scholz and Armin Laschet saying they don't want to follow the US down a path of decoupling. I think, it is really China, and Jörg, you wrote about this in the European Chamber report earlier this week. It is really China that is in the process of decoupling. The US is reacting to this. So this is a reality that I think Germans and Europeans will need to grapple with. And I think the likelihood is increased after this German election that they will grapple with it. I don't think they can ignore it. I'll stop there.
Well, no, I think you misread my intentions. You were supposed to be the highlight or the icing on the cake. So that's why you're last. Clearly, let me say, just for the chamber, we actually, in our decoupling report in January, thought that the US has started this process and has steered China into a discussion of self-reliance, which worries us because we think that self-reliance in China leads to lower GDP growth. We would like China to stay engaged or get even more engaged. But Reinhard, after you heard your colleagues speaking, in particular, of course, your party leader going to Brussels first, will there be a stronger Brussels or Europe-focused policy? Will there be more solidarity when it comes towards the US or towards China? How will Europe become a little bit more, as Joachim put, a little bit more stronger in its own self-certainty?
Well, Jörg, I would side with Noah when he said the criticism has been quite frequently that the chancellor has on many occasions pursued a Germany first policy. That doesn't just pertain to China. Look at the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It was never supported by a majority in the European Council or the European Parliament. Many of our neighbors were opposed to it. The US tried to obstruct. She saw it through. Still, the question is still open whether it will get the final permit, but this kind of attitude has been hampering Germany's ability to lead the European Union. Because when the big guys, the important capitals go on their own, they set a tone that others will follow. And you've seen the case of Cyprus that blocked sanctions on Belarus for a couple of weeks or months even, because they used their veto in the European Council, being unhappy with Europe's Turkey policy. If that becomes the rule, then Europe cannot be operating as one single actor. So I think the major capitals have to set the tone And this is what is increasingly understood in Berlin, that in order to set the tone and keep the flock together, Germany has to play more the European card. And it's also, I think, mandated by the relative change of Germany's relative strength in the relations to the major international powers, to the superpowers. Germany just doesn't own the spoon that is long enough to eat from the same bowl with the big powers of the world perennially, and unless we use the European spoon, well, the meal might not be such a joyful event. So I think that is a very fundamental development of change that you will see, not without contradictions, not without maybe also goof ups, but that's going to be the direction, I would say.
Jumping as we speak now, High Representative Borrell actually is in a phone call with Foreign Minister Wang Yi today. So that will be interesting to see what comes out of it. Will China policy after the Afghanistan debacle, after the submarine deal, change towards Europe? Will China stay open in order to see what Scholz is coming up with? What do you expect? More easing, a bit of more friendly terms, or will China keep its assertive position that it has taken for quite a while? You have to unmute yourself, Jumping. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I ask you, joking our meeting was take place, same place as Wang Yi's meeting with the European counterpart. I thought it was coincidence. Yeah. Well, I think China's policy towards Europe has been consistent. Let me put it in this way. When you talk with any, this is Yonke, you are in Beijing. When you talk with any Chinese, research think tank people, or they would tell you China-European relations has some problems, but all in all is fine. So I don't think the interruptions of transatlantic relations will have some either positive or negative impact on China-European relations. Let me put it in this way. A lot of people believe China-Europe bilateral relations has its own foundation, has its own internal energy. It's not that weak to be influenced, shaped by the third party or outside forces. So in other words, Wang Yi and his counterpart, continue to have this so-called strategic dialogue. For me, it's not a surprise at all.
Joachim, actually, you have a dark past, so to speak. You worked for the car industry. And there has been always the criticism is that China policy is driven out of Wolfsburg, which of course is not true. But to what extent do you think with this new government, with a gentleman as chancellor like Mr. Scholz, who is a very cautious character, at least he comes to me across, how much is business in a position in order to influence China policy? Will the new government listen more to business or less so?
Very good question, but very difficult to know. Actually, you know better. let me put it this way. Let me first respond to remarks made by our predecessors. I forgot who made this point. Germany's foreign policy will be Germany's new government policy will under pressure from European other members of the European Union. My own reading is that Janke, you made the point. My own point is, my own reading is actually European policy was Germanized. Germans set the tone to others follows. For example, you know, the famous partner competitor rival theory framework. Who made this first? Germans, yeah. So and the European Union Commission took over and becomes the European approach. And by the way, United States, Joe Biden's government also used this three level things. So so we don't underestimate the Germans' influence and the Europeans' influence on the other side of the transatlantic. That's my first point. Come to what the new government, especially the future chancellor's opinion on China will be shaped by whom? Well, I think, you know, my own view is whoever in the government will be balanced. You know, to sit on one side is not something we can expect. I think he definitely, yeah, not she. He will listen to business people's views, and he will listen to his junior partners in the coalition. He will need to only. There's one thing certain. We think, you know, I don't know what the initial period, transitional period, because think about Juncker, you mentioned the early years of Chancellor Merkel.
Yeah,
for European relations. So we don't know what the early period would look like, because maybe it's ups, downs, and Juncker mentioned the frictions, tough stances. Okay, but if time, you know, goes on, when time goes on, I think, you know, pragmatical, we expect pragmatical will become the dominant views, which means, you know, he will think about, you know, the European, German policy toward China more and more in a balanced way. Let's wait and see.
Well, Joachim, again, you worked for a couple of German high-profile companies. What will be the connection there, the kind of engagement level, in particular, as the representation of German business, the BDI, is becoming far more vocal about the shortcomings in the business relationship of Germany and China? What's your take?
Very good point.
Wait. Let Joachim speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that's a very good question. And going back to what Reinhard said in his opening remarks, I think especially the Green Party, they did over the past year really their homework. And there is no competition between the business community and the Greens like it was used to be in the past. I believe overall, I mean, it's now very generic, yeah. But overall, I believe the business society, they have understood that we need to foster the transformation of our society as well as our economy. We need to marriage economical, ethical, and environmental aspects with each other, and we need to bring that into a European strategy. Yeah, so this is actually where I am, at least. I believe that it is actually maybe even a chance of the new government to start with a partnering approach. Yeah, to really invite all parties to do joint efforts. Yeah, I mean, look, for just one example, COP26 is coming up. It's hard to imagine the outcome as everything is in the air, but have here like really joint efforts would be a great sign. G7 presidency, I mentioned that. EU presidency by France, I mentioned that. So there's a chance to do this in partnership, and this is actually what I would praise for.
Janke, you said that if everything once shall remain the same, everything has to change. But to what extent has a new German government a political space in order to change things, given that it has to look at polls in order to win the next elections? And if it looks at polls, obviously, when it comes to China, we'll see that over the last 10, 15 years, China went from 65% positively viewed to 75% unfavorably viewed. So what is the political space for German politicians in order to maneuver in this field where actually public opinion is rather anti-Chinese, I'm afraid?
Yeah, and I think, but I think the Merkel government has not used the political space that was available to actually adapt policies to in Germany's interest. And it actually had more of a political mandate to do so than it has used it so far. I do think that we have to really be careful with the words that we're using here. I used pragmatic, and Professor Fung used pragmatic as well. What does pragmatic mean now, pragmatic China policy? I think a pragmatic China policy, from my perspective, includes an acceptance of the reality that German companies and German politicians face in China. The reality that cooperation is becoming not less likely because the Europeans do not want to cooperate. This is the Germans are religiously married to the idea of multilateralism and cooperation and mutual understanding. This is something that's incredibly important to the Germans. So whenever there is an opportunity to do so, the Germans and the Europeans will try to do that. But we are currently in a context where, from the Chinese side, we're not really having a very cooperative environment, and where we are not seeing that European interests are being served in a way that is kind of on our terms, or in Germany's or European interest. So I think understanding that reality more closely and saying, okay, but if we want to compete in the future, if we want to level playing fields in third markets in the future, if we want our industries to survive in the future, then we have to draw the lessons from the kind of developments that have taken place over the last few years, and have to take a much more pragmatic and less hopeful approach in terms of what the promise of the Chinese market, the promise of our potential mutually win-win cooperation could look like, and look more at that reality of very kind of clearly assess what is the situation, what are the areas in which we can move forward, what are the areas that are already off limits, and what are the areas in where we have to kind of find out whether we can still coexist. And I do think that decisions like leaving the onshore market in the Chinese wind industry by Siemens Gamesa, these are signs of the time. These are signs that are telling European industry you're not welcome. And this is something that needs to be acknowledged in Europe as well, and is part of a pragmatic new approach.
So to everybody on the line, I just encourage you to come up with questions. I will ask Noah the last question for this panel, and then basically it's your turn, and you have to also pinpoint to Esther who you address this to. Noah, from my experience in Beijing, very often I come across the question, how independent is German foreign policy? How much is it determined by the White House? And I come across this kind of, the US is behind virtually everything, to the point where I have the suspicion that actually China believes that Europe doesn't have its own opinion. So it's a bit extreme maybe, but at the same time, really, when it comes to the accreditation of pharmacies, Sinovac and Sinopharm in Europe, they believe the Americans would not allow it all the way to the kind of climate policy. So in a way, so how is this perception growing? The US is behind everything. And of course, for you as an American, are you behind everything?
Me personally, or?
No, not personally.
No, I think this is a source of huge frustration in European capitals. The idea that every sort of pushback against Beijing that comes from Berlin, Brussels, Paris, etc., is seen as sort of the EU doing the bidding of the United States. I think if you look back, the European line on China has developed and hardened in tandem with the US line. It has not been following the US line. If you go back to 2016, KUKA, you know, some of these big Chinese acquisitions in Germany, which sort of changed the debate. This was before the Trump administration was even in place. And in 2017, just as Trump was coming in, the EU, European capitals were pushing an investment screening mechanism for Europe, et cetera. So Europe has not been following the US on this. I think it is gone down a similar path, but gone in a slightly different direction. The EU focus has been on sort of technocratic, regulatory, defensive measures, and of course the EU has shied away from this more confrontational approach that we've seen from Washington, especially the previous administration. I would agree with Janka's point about pragmatic policy. Pragmatic policy today looks very different from the German perspective than a pragmatic policy 10 years ago. And I would distinguish pragmatic policy from the correct policy that we often hear often read about in these readouts from conversations between European and Chinese officials, where from Beijing you hear this hope that Europe and Germany will continue a correct policy. Look, very quickly, we're not talking about cutting off all economic ties with China. We're talking about a more strategic, a more joined up, a more forward-looking approach to the relationship with China. It's about resilience, diversification. It's about thinking about economic and national security and embedding this in policy a bit more. And I think for Germany, you know, Japan is a better model than the United States. Japan has overhauled its national security structures. It is taking a serious look at its supply chains. It has become more outspoken on issues like Taiwan. And it is a country that, like Germany, that has very close economic ties with China. Of course, the security risks emanating from China are much more front and center in Japan than they are in Germany. But I do think Germany can learn a lot from Japan. It's not about following the US every step of the way.
All right, then I'll leave it up to Esther. There's a couple of questions. I let her cherry pick, and I look at the questions, I see it not addressed to particulars. So maybe Esther throws it at you, and whoever jumps first gets the answer.
Yes, so indeed we have a number of questions, and I think that in general, I guess that an initial remark would be that I was just reading this ECFR report on the German elections, and one of the findings of a survey was that only 17% of respondents had confidence in Germany being able to lead the way on China-related issues. So I think that it will be interesting to see how the new leadership manages this situation. So moving on into the questions. There was one question related to the length that it would take to the coalitions to be formed and how it would affect the German-China relationship, but also the EU-China relationship. And I think that's an interesting question because right now we're seeing a big rethink in EU-China relationship going on at the EU level. We've seen the European Parliament report being approved a couple of weeks ago, and there are discussions at the EEAS level, and there will be discussions at the council level. So I was wondering, what will a potential inward-looking Germany for the next half a year, as Noah was mentioning, look like? How it will affect the overall China strategy of the EU?
Well, maybe I grab the opportunity to address that question, if you allow me, Esther. First of all, I'm not at all convinced that the negotiations will be as drawn out as they were 4 years ago. In fact, if the leader of the Free Democrats wouldn't have run from the negotiating table at a very late hour, we might have concluded the first phase of those negotiations within a couple of days. I think we were close to a final result when he stood up and left, and then it took a couple more months. So I would wager. I would risk a certain wager that we will have a new government before Christmas. And of course, this is also warranted because there's so much going on. But look, I mean, government, the German government will still be there. We have a very competent German ambassador to the EU, Ambassador Klaus, who served in Beijing before. So he's a major voice on some of the European China policy issues. He'll be around. The president of the European Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen, just gave a new thrust to the European connectivity policy by offering her Global Gateway initiative. The European Union, with a strong support from Germany, including from the Chancellor's office and the Foreign Ministry, put on the table its new Indo-Pacific strategy. So you shouldn't be afraid of Germany disappearing from the global scene for a long number of months. That's not going to happen.
So Joachim, just asking you as an insider, Christmas with the new chancellor, and when G7 presidency falls into Germany's lap in January, we're going to be there.
It would be my bet as well, and I wouldn't be too much concerned. And why not? I mean, he pointed it out. We still got an administration, a government in place. Yeah, it's not the first time we are seeing a change in command. Yes, Merkel was in charge for 16 years, and people are used to her and to her all around the world. But I personally believe it will speed up very soon in Berlin, and that we're going to be surprised how soon we're going to see an election of the next chancellor.
Maybe Esther, can I just tickle you to ask the investment agreement question to Reinhard and Jung-Ping, because both are big fans of this project.
Oh, if you insist, absolutely. I mean, there have been several questions on the investment agreement and what would a new German leadership mean for this. I would actually expand this to overall trade relations, because as of now, it's not certain at all how the discussions on the agreement are going to evolve. So I think it would be interesting to see how other trade aspects will be managed under new leadership.
Maybe Beijing first, huh?
Okay, I know why people are interested in Germany's role on this particular issue, say AI, because without Chancellor Merkel, without the rotating president of Germany, in last second half of last year, we may not able to say the birth or conclude of this agreement. Am I fair to say that? Okay, no, it has been frozen, obviously. So people are talking about, we need to lift the sanctions. Okay, that's a good point. But the more important question is, who is going to be first? Okay, so I want to know our European colleagues what their views, because my personal view, this section was put forward by the Europeans first. So maybe you guys first. I don't know. And again, you're absolutely right. This agreement is negotiated with more than double efforts, because normally in normal time it takes a lot of negotiation, but this time it was a pandemic period. They don't able to physically to see each other and made this incredible agreement. It's a huge achievement. Why people made so much effort to do this? Because it is so important. As a community, building the community in Beijing, you know much better. This agreement is supposed to stabilize China-European commercial relations for the coming years. Is that right? So we need to think about how to break this deadlock.
So Reinhard, who goes first?
I leave this to you.
Nobody goes. I would predict that this will remain in the freezer for a substantial amount of time. You said, Jörg, I think it's been negotiated for, what was it, 14 years? No, 7 years, and it may need 7 years to ratification. Look, I have three aspects here. Number one, the AUKUS mess that we just experienced may motivate some people around European capitals to reassess the merit of kicking your transatlantic partner in the knee. Because the pain we felt around Europe when we were excluded from that deal mirrors the kind of criticism we encountered in Washington when Merkel pulled off CAI without waiting for the advent of Biden. So maybe that creates another moment for reflection. Second, I believe that China is mistaken when they argue that this is mostly in the European interest. So if Europe wants to have it, Europe has to move. I see a strong political interest. Xi Jinping invested so much political capital into this, and it's so important for his overall trading strategy that I see a strong Chinese interest to pull it off. So China has to move. And third, the longer it sits on the shelf or in the freezer, the less relevant it may become, because you are increasingly confronted with new developments in China's economic policy. Look at the data management rules, look at the anti-sanctions law, look at the coercive measures that China is taking. And then you go back and look at CAI and you find that it helps zero in all those cases. So I know voices from German industry that are saying, well, this deal is not what we really need. They don't say that publicly. Publicly, they encourage it. Publicly, they do say, yes, better than nothing. But this is very low key. That is half-baked. That is lukewarm. But the questions about China's coercive policies, China's decoupling strategies are growing bigger, and CAI is increasingly inadequate to deal with that.
So that is nearly biblical, Reinhard. 7 years negotiations, 7 years in the fridge. So let's see how that turns out. But Noah, what is this between Europe, Germany, and the US? I mean, the outgoing and incoming administration in DC was very unhappy about this investment agreement. So by definition, they should be very happy that it's in the freezer for an unforeseen period of time.
Yeah, well, I think they are happy that it's in the freezer. I would agree with Reinhard that it's not going to get out of the freezer anytime soon. I think the Greens are very critical of this deal, have been from the beginning. I think the FDP is a bit more mixed. the Social Democrats. I'm not sure what Olaf Scholz what his stance on this is. He hasn't really spelled out a stance on a lot of the big issues, including 5G and Huawei's role in the 5G network. So we'll have to see how this new government comes together. I do agree it may happen faster than it did 4 years ago, which was really drawn out with the FDP pulling out at the very last minute. Yeah, we'll have to see. I think with the AUKUS deal, there was some reporting yesterday that the French were trying to water down this Trade and Technology Council statement. I think this is something that we have to keep an eye on, because we had we saw this French fury in the aftermath of this deal being announced, followed by this Macron-Biden call and a sort of patching up of differences. And I think everyone is thinking, oh, we're going to go back to normal. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think this makes it arguably more difficult for a new German government if you have a French government that is pushing perhaps more aggressively on the sort of idea of strategic autonomy. So one has to hope that Europe can come together, new German government, new French government, and then really engage with the United States. This is we during the Trump administration, we had virtually no dialogue between the EU and the US. So this is hugely important. Doesn't mean that both sides will agree on everything, but that dialogue is important in and of itself.
All right, another question from the members.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, just to add one thing, because I think it's really important that we don't get this mixed up in the debate. The sanctions and CAI are inextricably linked because China chose to do so. And I think that's something that we need to underscore, that the European reaction was delinked from CAI. It was a reaction to human rights violations. This was sanctions that were targeted and very specific. And I think it's important to not mix the two up too much, because now they are a precondition because of China's reaction. And that's, I think it is better to keep these things separately, but they were politically linked. And just in terms of the question, who needs to go first? I think that would be my answer to it, is like someone has to delink this again. And the reason for the sanctions on the European side have not gone away. And so there is very limited potential also for the European side to lift the sanctions. I just wanted to add that because I thought it was going a bit kind of across there.
Well, Esther has a question, I guess, but also keep in mind, this is 90 minutes, a webinar, as long as a soccer game. Normally in the last 10 minutes, the best team scores. So Esther.
Yes, actually, we still have several questions from participants. Maybe one of them that perhaps Janka, you could address is we've been talking a lot about potential changes, right, that the new coalition could bring. But one of our attendees is wondering what kind of legacy policies can we expect from the Merkel era to pass on to the new government?
I think the commitment to dialogue is something that will continue to be a feature of German politics. And I think that's something that no government will eradicate. That's really important. And that has been a legacy also of the Merkel administration. But other than that, I do think there will be a massive kind of stock take. I think everything needs to come on the table and everything needs to be sorted out and thought through. And then that doesn't mean that all of the policies will be wiped off the table and will be not in place anymore. But I think there needs to be a proper reassessment of the usefulness of each approach, of each format, of the multitude also of dialogue formats that exist between China and Germany and China and Europe. That all needs to come to the table and a pragmatic reassessment needs to take place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at your China dialogues, we have 60 plus of those going on. So yeah, it's definitely a complex picture that we're looking at. Maybe on to the next question then. A couple of our attendees have asked about the reaction of other member states to a potential change associated to the new German leadership. Now, there are a couple of aspects here that we can talk about. First of all, we can look at the German leadership position in terms of uniting Europe, and Europe has already addressed that a bit in terms of cooperation. But one question would be, how would a new German leadership perhaps lead in areas where there are a bit of more wild cards like Hungary? That would be one question. And then the second question is about differing economic interests among member states, and how member states that do not have such strong economic interests in China would react to a potential reinforcement of the Franco-German kind of axis.
Well, if you allow me to try taking a shot at the question, I would want to highlight three dimensions. One, both the Liberals and the Greens have very strong policies on rule of law, not just domestically, but also as one of the fundamental principles of on which the European Union has been built. So you should expect from a government in which both of them play a role that it will take the tougher stance vis-a-vis the deviations from that course that you see in different European countries that had been neglected far too long by the conservatives in the past, including by Merkel. Second, on economic integration of the European Union, I think the Social Democrats are much closer to the French position than the conservatives have ever been. And I would expect new initiatives, for instance, with regard to the completion of the banking union and other integrative steps economically. And as regards the balance between East and West in Europe, it may sound funny to some of the attendants, but there are quite a few voices from Central and Eastern Europe that would be quite happy with, including conservatives, by the way, that would be quite happy to see the Greens joining the German government, because they expect of us that we pay more attention to their concerns than has been the case in the past.
Anybody else? Or Esther?
All right. We have a couple more questions, perhaps one for Noah and then one for Professor Feng. For Noah, the question is more about nuances in terms of who would be leading Germany within the next few months. We have seen that Scholz is considered quite a transatlanticist, yeah, one of our listeners was wondering how this would translate depending on who is leading in the future. So maybe we start with this one and then we continue with Professor Feng.
Yeah, I have to be honest, I don't think of Scholz as a transatlanticist. I think both he and Laschet, I think it was mentioned earlier that Scholz was asked where he would go first. He said Paris. I think both he and Laschet have close connections with Paris. Scholz, as finance minister, worked very closely with his French counterpart, Bruno Le Maire, on a number of European issues. Laschet, of course, grew up near the French border in the west of Germany. So I think, I think we're gonna have to see if you do have a government led by Scholz, that's what it looks like now. How is this government gonna come together, together with the Greens, together with the Free Democrats, and sort of integrate the different views on foreign policy? I think it's been mentioned the Greens and the FDP have been advocating for a more, a tougher, more assertive policy towards China. I think the Greens have sounded very transatlanticist, which is ironic because this party was sort of formed in the 70s in part in reaction to the Vietnam War. But certainly Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck have sounded much more transatlanticist. So I think we're going to, it's important to watch how these coalition negotiations play out, what the coalition agreement that comes together, what it says about China, what it says about the relationship with the US. I wouldn't put too much importance on the coalition agreement. I think what is really important is how policies are implemented once the government's in place. But that is perhaps an early signal to look for. And I liked Janka's point earlier about how it was the sort of technocrats or officials in the US administration who were really responsible for the Trump administration's approach. It wasn't necessarily Trump himself. It was people who had been sort of clamoring for a shift in their approach, in the US approach to China. So my question for Janka is, who is going to be the Matt Pottinger of Berlin? Who's going to be the Peter Navarro? If we can identify those, maybe we'll see a bit more clearly.
So I would like to finish off with maybe Joachim, but I can't resist asking Reinhard, because when Schröder and Fischer were running the government 1998 to 2005, Reinhard actually was Secretary General of the Green Party. So he's very much, he still has possibly a lot of scars from that period of time. But Joachim, to you first, and then maybe Reinhard finishes off. Who's going to determine again German policy towards China? Is it the chancellors? I think it's going to be Scholz, or is there going to be more of a say for the foreign minister? And then, of course, give us a name.
Okay, so for sure, the chancellor, he got a big vote on the foreign affairs strategies. But as Reinhard said, it's a matter of fact that the two coalition partners are very strong partners, and you need to align with them. Otherwise you're going to do the same mistake as Schröder did in '98 by starting with a disaster, being not aligned and communicating nonsense, actually. I want to maybe take the chance, as Noah pointed out, the challenges we have in between the transatlantic partnership. And I do believe this affects our discussion here as well. I currently believe that the EU is not longer US first choice. The US is clearly defeating its #1 position. That's at least the ultimate goal of the US. And if you look back, on the digitalization, the US won the first wave. So that was Silicon Valley won the first wave, but Shenzhen won the second. And I see the current geopolitical debates, the proxy war against Huawei, and many other aspects are actually the ultimate reaction of this fight. Who will become the #1 on this one? And this affects, of course, the China relations from Germany, from EU, from US, and the entire geopolitical the next month, which will be of course thrilling.
So Reinhard, maybe a final word from you, as you have been seeing all of this up close, and I cannot resist to say, are you going to stay in Brussels?
I intend to. I think I have a very, very rewarding job there. And I also think I have an impact. To answer your question, there's always been a tendency of the chancellors to centralize foreign policy, in particular the most important portfolios. When Schröder entered office, Fischer was the dominating foreign minister. After 2 periods in government, Schröder had overshadowed Fischer, and Merkel has centralized foreign policy even more. But there will be a new game in town, I would expect, with the creation of a kind of a national security council that will integrate the bureaucratic forces more, and that will create a new game. So this will not be the chancellery on its own as much as it has been. Second, even when it comes to the chancellor, it makes a difference to say this in shorthand, if the chancellor just listens to Wolfsburg or whether the chancellor listens to the German Federation of Industry. And third, I think you should not underestimate, and I feel China often does that, underestimate the role of parliaments and public opinion in the European political system. These are independent forces that should not be underrated, and that is certainly also the case with regard to Scholz. I feel Scholz is very smart. He's a great strategist. He's a guy with a lot of vision who doesn't always show the way in which he sort of calculates. But I think he'll run a cautious coalition government because he knows that he is not building this on a lot of his own strength. He has to rely on the strength of his partners too.
Well, thank you very much, Reinhard. This is 90 minutes over, no overtime, no penalty shootout, because definitely we have a winner. It's you in the audience. I had a great panel with 5 contributors. I would like to thank you all very much for this. And let's see if Christmas sees us with a new chancellor, and you can basically bet maybe on a good red wine to see if Merkel or Scholz are gonna do the New Year's Eve address. With this, thank you very much. Thanks to Brussels, Berlin, and whatever, Beijing, and see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jörg.
Take care, guys. Bye.